Shaw is here. Mike and I discuss issues as they unfold throughout the day, the week, the month, the year. Mike, look, obviously, there's really no other issue to discuss than what the hell is going on in Ukraine and whether or not this could be something that could escalate into a World War III. So let me just have, first of all, I'd like to hear your thoughts on the topic and what you think is going on.
Well, I was a little surprised. I mean, I thought it was a lot of saber rattling,
right?
But suddenly they go ahead and launch.
Yeah.
And why this happened with Biden and not Trump is the subject of some speculation, of course.
Right. Sure.
But how far Putin's going to take it? It is interesting that it seems to be a somewhat, and this sounds silly, but restrained approach in that it's very unusual to invade a country and then hours afterward offer terms of surrender. But I'm not sure what the long-term plan is. If he's really interested in creating a new empire, if he seems to be taking advantage of everybody around him being weak, what the long-term plan is, because people don't like being occupied.
Right. And I think Ukraine, I mean, they seem to have a fairly strong and healthy nationalist movement there. You know, they're not exactly going to roll over. I mean, I get the fact that Crimea and that eastern region, that they are Russian ethnically, and maybe I could get that Putin could slice that off, but the Ukraine proper itself, with around Kiev and the area in the western part of the country, I don't think that they're going to sit too easily to having a perpetual Russian occupation.
Well, no, and of course, in the West, they despise the Russian.
Yeah.
In fact, your viewers will perhaps recall that the Western Ukrainians sided with the Nazis, not so much because they loved the Nazis, but they hated the Russians even more during
That's
World War.
right. No, I know that. In fact, I heard an interesting interview with this podcast, the Subversive podcast. I don't know if you know about her, but she's very good. Her name escapes me right now, but she's her family is from Ukraine, and she was saying that when the Nazis occupied Ukraine, their occupation was fairly benign compared to the Soviet occupation.
Yeah.
When they came back, and it's not that they were pro-Nazi, but they were just glad to be out from under the yoke of Stalin, and they were, don't forget that the Stalin regime, I mean, they had the Holodomor, which was the forced starvation of millions of Ukrainians.
Oh, yeah.
So it's not, it's not an easy relationship there. So, and I think that, Putin has been on the record pretty much from day one, saying that he wants to restore the Russian Empire, and that was his intention. And Condoleezza Rice, when she was Secretary of State, she talked about this in an interview I heard recently, where she said, yeah, Putin, I met with him and he's like, we're going to restore the Russian Empire. And on the one hand, she says you could think he's just crazy, but on the other hand, he was a KGB general and he knew what he was talking about. And if you look at the maps on the wall in those offices, you see a big Russia.
Oh yeah.
So they see obviously that Biden is weak and he's viewed as illegitimate, frankly. I don't want to go too far on that one.
Biden's weak, and of course there was a lot of commentary made about the NATO video, which perhaps you saw, "We Are NATO," and it had the most
I mean, like the political correct stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
We're transgenders and we're this and that. And, Putin is looking at that and saying, really, gee, our soldiers know where to go when they need to go to the men's room. They're not worried about that. They're worried about, moving, how to use a Kalashnikov rifle. They're not, what I'm saying? So, yeah, I mean, he probably saw that as weakness. And clearly, Biden is not viewed as a legitimate leader. I don't want to go too far on this because we are running live on YouTube right now, but In America, this is all censored, but in Europe, they take a certain view of the administration, and it's very different than what we're allowed to discuss here. Putting that aside, the fact is that, when they see this regime, they see weakness as opposed to Trump, which represented strength and peace through strength. And they also see an old man who is hurling insults and, speaking incoherently, saying, "Oh, Biden is a killer," and this kind of stuff. It's just not smart. And, he's provoking them. He's poking a stick in them. And so they have every reason to feel that they can get away with it. And I think that's what it looks like they're trying to do now.
Yeah, and of course, not that this comes as a surprise to anybody with an IQ over room temperature, but this whole business of Biden's expertise in foreign policy. I mean, what a joke. Everything he's ever done has been wrong.
And he's surrounded by these real nincompoop, weak-looking people like Blinken and Jake Sullivan, and this is what and Kamala Harris. I mean, they're going to decide where America's role in the world. I mean, it's the United States is a laughingstock. Nobody believes anything. I think the new German prime minister didn't even return Biden's call. I mean, it's not. There's no sense of like an American presence and an American resolve. I mean, look, I think Trump did have that, but I think also to a certain extent, Obama had that too.
Yeah.
I mean, these were legitimate presidents who stood up when they had to, whereas Biden there's nobody home. It's like there's a sense of, of opportunity. And that's why you now have China flying sorties over Taiwan. You've got trouble in Israel. You've got trouble around the world. I mean, the whole world is unstable right now.
At what point, if ever, is there this epiphany on the part of this pathetic left-wing media that maybe someone's going to speak out and say, "Hey, maybe this wasn't a great idea." Anybody but Trump.
But because the left-wing media is part of the same Biden cabal. I mean, they think they're actually. I mean, it's getting really bizarre. They're trying to blame Trump.
Yeah, of course.
I mean, really. I mean, Mitt Romney of all people, trying to blame Trump. What a disappointment he is as a former governor of my state. And you have them say, and they're resurrecting the whole cockamamie conspiracy theory that Trump was colluding, playing footsie with Russia. In other words, he stole the election of 2016 because Putin helped him do that. Talk about conspiracy theories about stolen elections.
So Putin helped him win so that he wouldn't do anything for 4 years. And then after somebody else comes in, then he makes his move.
Brilliant.
I see. Brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, it's meanwhile, Obama didn't do much when Putin moved into Crimea. He was busy, he sent blankets, I think.
Yeah.
And of course, Biden and his son, I don't want to go too far into this one, but let's just say there's some pretty unethical and corrupt behavior with regard to Ukraine that we found out about. I mean, I'm afraid that if I say this, I might be accused of spreading, quote, misinformation. Yeah. We'll let people look into it by yourself, make up your own opinion. I'm not commenting on it. I'm simply noting that under Trump, you had a strengthening of the alliance with Eastern Europe. You had a strengthening for Ukraine. You had shipments of real military material there. And you had the U.S. Navy in the Black Sea. Now they've been driven out of the Black Sea. I don't know if you know that.
Yes.
And you have position like what Reagan talked about, peace through strength. But, Putin didn't know what Trump would do. He respected Trump, and that Trump at the same time wanted to have a good relationship with Russia. What's wrong with that? I mean, that was interfered by with all the whole conspiracy theories, the blue anon, business about Trump spying for Russia. But look, I mean, we should have had a developed, good, solid relationship with Russia, especially is in opposition to China. Now we've shown Russia.
One thing. You can only have a good relationship with Russia if you're left wing, because then it's genuine. So Franklin Roosevelt, then that's fine.
Well, that's because back then Russia was communist. But we should have had a good relationship with post-communist Russia.
Of course.
And rather than Biden throwing the insults and all these conspiracy theories, which only provoked Russia. Not that they wouldn't have done it anyway, but the point is, at least if we had operated from a position of strength, we wouldn't have the whole of Europe teetering on world war.
Well, if you want to hear a clueless tweet, and this is paraphrasing, but when all the drumbeat of war was starting to occur a day or so ago, Stephen King actually tweeted out, "This is a mistake by Putin because this isn't Trump now."
So he thought he should have done it under Trump. He's made some really bizarre comments.
I think it was more the implication that now Biden is going to show what a strong response
Oh,
is.
I get it. Oh, yeah, sure. That's a good one.
I'm not sure
completely
at what point the guy became that clueless. It's maddening. I mean, everybody forgets that, they remember the good stuff that King has written, but there are a whole bunch of duds that.
Well, he used to come out with some really bizarre comments about Trump. I mean, he was like the one meathead from All in the Family. What's his name? Bob Reiner.
Right.
And also the Harvard professor. What's his name?
Oh, Larry Tribe.
Lawrence Tribe. I get both of their tweets, and talk about tin hat, like conspiracy nuts. Yeah. I mean, it's like, and it's this. It's like they're drinking out of some kind of a, hallucinogenic brew. I mean, their hatred, this irrational hatred for Trump, is really, really bizarre. It's a sickness. I get the fact that people didn't like George W. Bush. He got in a war. I mean, I didn't support that war. Sure, that's a reasonable thing. People had reasonable dislike for Obama for his policies, but with Trump, it was not rational. There was no reason. I mean. It's something about it that, and I'm talking about this, and I think, Mike, you could probably attest to this on a personal level. People that I know and I've seen who were completely, marinating in Trump hatred, and they couldn't explain why. They were just bubbling. That there was something very, very strange about that. I mean, it makes me wonder if this isn't, kind of the culmination of many, many decades of research on mass mind control. I mean, I don't mean to, maybe I'm putting on a tin hat now.
I think there's a lot going on with it, but remember, he was an outsider.
Sure.
He's an alpha male in a world of omega males. I mean, let's be honest.
Especially now with look at the men around Biden. Oh my God.
Well,
Omega,
course,
never mind Omega.
Talk about weak tweets. So what does the UN do in the wake of this invasion? You get the Secretary of the General of the UN, Mr. Putin, in the name of humanity, stop this.
It's worse. I mean, remember, we all criticized Neville Chamberlain, who was, a liberal of his day. Didn't want to go back into another world war. That was reasonable. But compared to these guys, he seems like, Attila the Hun. I mean, it's, he actually, was trying to negotiate something at the last minute. This isn't even that. This is just, they're sitting around with their their laptops, they don't know what the hell is going on.
No, they are so far removed from reality. And let's face it, Chamberlain gets a bad rap.
Right.
Had the British been as bellicose as all these armchair historians now would have wanted them to be, they would have got wiped out. They were in no position to go to a war in that early on in the mid 30s or whenever this was. So maybe he was trying to buy time. Maybe he was trying to negotiate. It's very nice after the fact to say, all right, he was an idiot. Look.
Right, sure.
Yeah.
He wanted to keep his country out of a war, and that's what his goal was. And Pat Buchanan wrote a good book about this years ago about Winston Churchill, and he noted that the fact that the British entered into a treaty with Poland, saying that we'll defend Poland if they're attacked, when they weren't in any position to do that, and France as well. And then when Hitler and Stalin divvied up Poland and started World War II, they were on the hook to declare war against Germany, and that's what led to the war. Who knows? We could look back and look in hindsight, but it might have been the divvying up of Poland was not anything that anyone in the West could do anything about. I mean, that was in between Germany and Russia. But I think perhaps Britain and France, by staying out of the war at that point, might have simply shored up their defenses and not set themselves up as an excuse for Germany to invade. I mean, who knows? I mean, I don't know what the answer was. That's a
yeah. I mean, it's all speculation, but
that's right.
But the point is that now, no one's going to want to. If it comes down to the United States being attacked, that's a different story. But you're not going to get a whole lot of sympathy for sending soldiers to protect the Ukrainian border when you don't care about your own border.
That's right. I mean, we're more concerned with Ukraine than we are with Mexico. But I think it also, I would suggest that we should note that, and this is a kind of a more leftist position, but I find myself agreeing with in somewhat resonating with this. I was watching Bill Maher the other night. He had Katrina vanden Heuvel on. She's the editor of Nation magazine. And she's been around a long time. She's fairly level-headed leftist. But she noted that, there was a coup d'etat in Ukraine in 2014 where the elected government of Yanukovych was overthrown. Right. I mean, and he was pro-Russia. Fine. I mean, I'm not defending him or that position. I mean, he probably was corrupt. That's what we're told. But it was replaced by a government that was aided by NATO and by the European Union, which wanted to move into Ukraine. Now, I can understand Russia's position there that, do they want to have Ukraine form a military alliance with their enemies and have basically, this would put literally American troops right on the border within earshot of Moscow. Right. I mean, this is like, an analogy could be made. This would be a
Cuban Missile Crisis, right?
Or it would be like if Mexico signed a military alliance with China and China started to put troops on the American border. This was very provocative. Now, I support Ukrainian sovereignty, and I think we all do, but
what does that mean, though? Who's in charge
of Ukraine?
Yeah.
Who knows what's happening there?
Yeah. Right now. I mean, you talk about the sovereignty, but it seems to be divided. There's ethnic Russians there. There's people that hate Russia. It's anything but unified.
No, it's kind of a failed state.
Yeah.
But even so, if Ukraine is hoping to have some sort of a peaceful existence and a sovereign existence, I would think that they would not be forming alliances with NATO and with the European Union, and they would keep a more friendly posture toward Russia. I mean, it's just the way it is. I mean, we could give an example of Finland. Finland, they were pro-Nazi during World War II. They fought a war with Russia and won. But after the war was over, they had to contend with the Soviet Union. And they basically operated with care. They kind of were neutral. They didn't align themselves with NATO. They didn't align themselves with the West. They kind of tilted toward Russia. They considered Russia in all of their dealings in foreign policy. And it was called like Finlandization. And they became a very successful sovereign nation, like a startup nation, super amazing. And, but they were recognizing the realities of where they were. They had they were very, right next to Leningrad. And I think that's, it's kind of like in the Western Hemisphere, I mean, the Monroe Doctrine, right, written by John Quincy Adams, 1822, 1823. It basically said that the Western Hemisphere is America's sphere of influence, that we support sovereignty amongst the American nations, right, and we oppose any attempt by a foreign power, back then the big empire was Britain and France, to come in and interfere in the business of these nations. And it's kind of, Russia has that same thing going on with its immediate neighbors in Eastern Europe. I mean, to me, that's sensible. I understand that. And it's just a balance of power question.
Well,
So,
you would think that something could have been tried with diplomacy before you just roll the tanks in. But
and having said that, I do think that Poland is an amazingly powerful nation since the fall of the Soviet Union that has allied itself to the West. They have joined NATO, and they don't mess around. I mean, Russia's not going to attack Poland, I don't think. I mean, they've got a very, very qualified, they're not messing around with any of the, worrying about where their soldiers go to the bathroom. They've got well-trained, tough military that's ready to fight. And I think Russia knows that and respects it. And they're allied with the West, and that's fine. I just think that Ukraine is a little step too far. That's right at the heart of Russia. So that's my analysis of it.
Yeah. And what's going to happen, I don't know. If I had to predict something, I think that Putin's going to try suing for peace aggressively, because he doesn't want this thing to go on much longer. It's not going to look good.
No.
And we'll see what happens. But unfortunately, the U.S. has been a non-entity in this matter.
Oh yeah, ridiculous. I mean, we didn't even have the sanctions. I mean, and even not that they would matter anyways, because I think the sanctions have already been tapped out.
Well,
Russia doesn't care.
Yeah, it's even worse. I mean, after this occurred, Biden is now talking about more sanctions, as if
it's a joke, and it's destabilizing for the whole world, because it shows, in a way, it's proving what China claimed about the United States, that we're a toothless tiger. And unfortunately, that seems to be what we're becoming.
So does this mean that there's nobody in that administration at all that's going to tap Biden on the shoulder and say, this ain't working? It's what, all about your yes.
Like can you think of anyone that's going to do that? Not. The media certainly is. They're busy asking what his favorite ice cream flavor is. I mean, nobody's going to ask him.
Right, but you're a media guy. How can these people live with themselves?
They have like a view of themselves and of the country that, is very much kind of hardwired into a very particular box, and they don't want to step outside it. It's not rational. I mean, look, Mike, you've talked about how these big corporations are losing a fortune because of woke politics. They don't seem to care.
Yeah.
We can talk about, the NFL, I mean, or any of the big sports teams or the entertainment teams. They don't seem to care that they're losing audience because of their politics. It's like maybe they've become so ideological that they don't care about profits. Maybe they have somewhat of a monopolistic control, so they don't have to worry about opposition, I think, which is the case with the media. You can't get anywhere unless you go through the big.
All right, let me use a different example. How come there's nobody within the NCAA who isn't realizing that women's sports is over?
There you go. Yeah.
So what? You're telling me that there's not a single voice inside the athletic community that's saying, wait, this is a total crock.
Well, it's the same reason they're not going to criticize China. There was that football, the owner of the Atlanta team, who spoke up about China's policies in Hong Kong, and he was attacked, not China. So it's there is a political agenda that holds the high ground, and they don't care. They don't want to hear.
It is affecting the NBA though. Their ratings are way down. They got destroyed by. I believe there was some NASCAR event.
Yeah.
That competed with the All-Star game, and the ratings were a joke.
And they're going to have to eventually answer to that. I mean, the Olympics was a disaster, complete joke. And you had that Chinese athlete. She was like out there for China, American young woman.
Right.
And I think that I heard that she got $37 million. Her family did. What a treasonous thing. I mean, this is like and she's praised. Oh, they're all, oh, so beautiful, so great. I mean, this wouldn't have happened, even like maybe 5 years ago.
Well, as Candice Bergen said, after she made a string of ridiculous movies that made a lot of money but did not further her acting career, she was quoted as saying something to the effect that I didn't realize how easy it was to sell out.
Yeah.
And maybe people have no self-respect because it's been part of what's happened to society. That they don't care and they don't have to stand for anything because they've got theirs. But there's a lot of people that don't have theirs that are still on the wrong side. What about all the female swimmers whose careers are destroyed? Why aren't they saying anything?
I know. I mean, well, female sports have been completely destroyed, not just even professional, high school, all of it.
Yeah.
Because now you can have some guy go in the locker room and basically rough them up.
Yeah.
I mean, where are the fathers of the world, with their daughters? I mean, why aren't people like, I mean, this is it's been brought up in some of these school board meetings, and people are vilified. They're called domestic terrorists for even mentioning it. But
because when you go through 50 plus years of denying the positive aspects of virility and whatnot,
right,
and unfortunately too many people buy into that,
the toxic masculinity stuff,
then
You're set
people
up for
are very
it.
suggestible on this, and it's a shame. To give you an analogy, and we won't get too deep for obvious reasons, but to see, despite all the negatives that are coming out that can't be denied, how officialdom is still standing up on the vaccine thing. And well, the CDC now is getting some heat. It was even written up in the New York Times, so YouTube has to like that they've been suppressing information.
Yeah, this was in the New York Times. I mean, we can't go too far on this one, but yeah, they've only released, the New York Times article says that they had only released a tiny amount of information, which I mean, maybe call me old fashioned, but that to me seems like scientific fraud. If you had been a college professor getting grants to write or do a research paper, and they found out that you had only put in a small amount of research, you'd probably lose your grant and you'd probably be kicked out of college.
Yeah, well, that kind of stuff used to happen, but now 3/4 of the science coming out of academia is garbage, so you can't distinguish it. In fact, ACSH had an article, I think it came out yesterday, American Council of Science and Health, of absurd studies saying how vaping doesn't help you quit smoking and it causes erectile dysfunction. And but if you looked at the data, it was ludicrous.
Well, Mike, what's going on? I mean, was there a political reason and an agenda with regard to why the CDC was refusing to release this information? I mean, the New York Times slant on it is basically that they weren't competent. They were saying, well, because they don't have the technical ability. Never mind the fact that they got like an $18 billion grant to do this. I mean, putting that aside, I mean, but there seems to me that's really kind of like a bunch of BS.
No, it's completely shameful. I mean,
well, that raises the question of what were they trying to, well, and we have to be careful here because this is YouTube, but what were they trying to do?
Okay, let me say this in a very gentle way.
Discussion.
Very gentle way.
Yes.
If you look at all the data, it's not necessarily favorable. All right.
Right.
There's more side effects than they want to admit, frankly. And we don't have to go any farther than that.
Can't go any further than that, other than to note that it's now generally been acknowledged by even the CDC and the establishment that the numbers during the pandemic were cooked, that in terms of hospitalization for the virus.
And Rochelle Walensky, who admitted that it was only about 5% of the people actually died of COVID.
Yeah, but even though Michelle Walensky admitted it, that doesn't mean YouTube's admitted it.
Yeah, well, that
They've purged people for quoting the
yeah,
CDC.
okay,
So we know.
that
Yeah.
I can't explain, because if you think, okay, YouTube is supporting the establishment, but now the establishment comes up with a counter narrative, then I truly don't understand what's going on.
Well, yeah, I mean, so we have a really bizarre situation where where does the science end and the politics begin with the pandemic? We all know there was a pandemic, but at what point?
Forget the pandemic. Where does the science separate from the politics? It doesn't anymore, because it's very simple. I've made this statement on numerous forums. There are way too many academic scientists. The budgets of the granting organizations are way too large. The quality of the research, here, let's use an analogy. Okay, right now there's 32 NFL teams. What if you and I came up with billions of dollars and decided, let's make 100 NFL teams? Would the quality of football overall deteriorate? Probably.
Yeah.
Okay. So if I put a lot of money out there, and there's a lot of people graduating with these useless science degrees in academia, and you got to put them to work and so on, what do you think is going to happen to the quality of the research?
Yeah, no, I get it, and not to mention the fact that the grants are directed in a certain way to get a certain outcome.
Oh, of course.
And that people are rewarded for getting to that outcome and punished when they don't. Look what happened to Dr. McCullough and Dr. Robert Malone. These were well-respected medical. I mean, in the case of Malone, he's one of the inventors of the vaccine. And they were ostracized and they've been purged in almost.
Well, they hit them very hard, because this was a case of two big stars turning on the agenda, and we can't have that. If these had just been minor individuals, it wouldn't have mattered. But
that's right. But again, it begs the question of exactly, we can't get into this today, but eventually it's going to come out. What exactly was this agenda? Why were they doing what they were doing? I will tell you that the only way we're ever going to get to the bottom of this is if we have a Republican Congress after the next midterm, and it's going to have to be a big Republican Congress.
I'll give you a benign.
Then we'll get to the bottom of it. Then there'll be hearings, even if they're rhinos. It does. I mean, we have to support them, because there's going to be enough patriots in the mix, enough MAGA people in the mix, that they're going to get to there's going to be hearings, and we're going to have a public airing of exactly what happened. If we don't have that, we'll never, ever know. It'll be completely buried.
I would say forget the conspiracy theories about trying to control the population and all that. Make it much simpler. We thought that we have the answer, all right? And maybe as time passes, that wasn't the answer.
Yeah.
So now there's pride involved. And now if you have big name people coming up and saying, this ain't the answer, it's credibility problems for these agencies, which frankly lost credibility decades ago. And anyone, I'm not the only one, anyone who's been following these agencies for the past 30 years knows that only too well. Mm-hmm. So they had to cling to it. It's not any more of a conspiracy than just hubris.
Well, I think you're being a little soft on them, Mike, because I think it's more, because it's more than just, hubris. It's possible criminality. I mean, if you have lies, if we find out that Fauci and Collins were lying about supporting gain of function research, which is what Senator Rand Paul stated that they were doing.
Well, I don't think there's any.
Then they're going to jail. I mean, that's a criminal matter, because they went behind the back of two American presidents, Obama and Trump, who basically signed. It was banned in this country.
Okay,
but we find out they were doing that, and they're not going to
understand what's going on here with that.
And by the way, I'm not saying they were, just for you YouTube censors.
All right. if they did do that, which
According to Senator Rand Paul,
yeah,
and others.
all right.
I think Ted
If
Cruz.
they did do that, then here's the problem. All right. If you do something that serious, we can't really punish you, because that would be acknowledging that it is actually possible to go against the president, to create research that killed, what, 6.5 million people or whatever the number is.
Yeah.
So it would be better to ignore that. Or as Joseph Stalin said, you kill 2 people, it's a tragedy. You kill 2 million people, it's a statistic.
That's right. Or the big lie theory of Hitler, which of course originated, I think, with the Soviets.
So it's the same thing with the Clintons. We can't go after the Clintons because
they'll never
we have
face
to
justice.
acknowledge.
Yeah.
Then we'd have to acknowledge that apparently it's possible, if you have enough power, prestige, or whatever.
You get special treatment. And
Yeah.
then, and plus the thing, I mean, we can't go there either. I think they're still sacrosanct, but their history is so ugly and so nasty that nobody can even bring their mind around it. You don't want to think it.
Right.
But bringing things up to the present, we have, it's now generally coming out, and I think it's starting to trickle out there, that things like the lockdowns and the children being masked and being forced, not to go to school,
Right.
and the passports and all of this stuff was not necessary. In fact, Johns Hopkins University's Krieger Institute just released a study saying, and they were one of the big promoters of the lockdowns originally, that it was probably not necessary. And I think that
it's CYA for them. Okay.
But the point is that as this comes out, and I think the final head of the spear were the Canadian truckers, because when we talked about this last week, when Justin Trudeau tried to demonize them and say, oh, they're Hitler, they're Nazis, nobody believed it in Canada. They had huge support, and that it triggered movements around the world, and that support was in the United States. And I think that the liberals in this country read the writing on the wall, and they're now rescinding the mandates, which they probably wouldn't have done otherwise. I really think the truckers played a major role in that. If it wasn't for the truckers, we could have had those for a long time. I mean, who knows how long. But now, even here in Boston, they are getting rid of it. Michelle Wu has got rid of the passport that you have to show to go into a restaurant. Some of the towns have gotten rid of the masks. In fact, the other day I went to my gym to do workouts, and people weren't wearing masks. The town of Newton has gotten rid of, and that's a very liberal town.
Yeah.
They've ended the mask mandate, and some people still were wearing them. That's fine, but most people weren't. So you have this going on.
Well, let me give you a personal example, and YouTube can't get mad about this. All right. I'm an old guy, so recently I've had to get a cardiologist. All right, fine.
Mhm.
First appointment with the cardiologist. Vaccine.
Oh, that would be
An
good.
appointment today. Didn't mention it.
Thank God. So yeah, now it's becoming, it's an issue. And now they're talking about the CDC has a site saying, be careful of blood clots. They're not saying why people are getting blood clots. And we're not going to go there. Let me just say this.
And we won't even talk about the undertakers.
Yeah, let's not. Oh, that's right. With the blood clots being found. Let's not even go there either. But let's just say this, because we have to wrap it up soon. But they are getting rid of the mandates. Canada, Trudeau has rescinded the emergency order. However, if you look at the fine print, they really haven't gotten rid of their power to reinforce it at any time they want. In fact, Biden just signed a bill. Reinvoke, but that's still there. And Biden just signed a bill extending the emergency. Doesn't mean that people are they'll still stop it, because there's an election coming, and there's a potential for workers' revolution. So they're stopping it for now. But they have assumed these extraordinary emergency powers, which they're not relinquishing and which are still there, and they will still implement them if, heaven forfend, there might be another pandemic. And all I can say is that we have to stop all of this. And if there is another pandemic, God forbid, we have to not let this come back. We should never have lockdowns again, or mask mandates, or passports. We can take care of ourselves. If we feel vulnerable to a virus, put on the mask, stay home, don't go into crowds, wash your hands, do
at your choice.
Exactly. And take reasonable precautions. Maybe the government could advise, but we should never again go back to this kind of fascist policy, especially since it's really questionable whether or not it had any effect.
Well, as we discussed when this thing was first starting, and I made the analogy to the polio epidemic,
right,
which I'm old enough to remember.
Yeah.
The very most that ever went on in terms of a quote lockdown, I mean, nobody wore any masks, but
Right.
there were occasional county fairs that were canceled. There
Sure.
were occasional big events that were canceled, but that was it. There
Oh
was
yeah, there was it was very selective and very pinpoint. There was none of this national thing where you have, the governor of Michigan announcing that you can go out and you can buy booze and lottery tickets, but you can't buy garden utensils and seeds.
Yeah.
With these arbitrary powers. I mean, there was none of that. So anyway, Mike, but the good news is that it is ending, and that inexorably, I don't think most Americans are going to want to go back to it or will go back to it. Anyways, I mean, even if they try it again, I just think people are tired of it and they're not doing it.
Well, I mean, it's so sad that we had to go through this,
Yeah,
that
exactly.
you couldn't predict that if you touch a hot stove, you're going to get burned. You actually had to do it and get burned. And so, oh, gee, that was not a good idea.
Well, that's how this works. Once you touch the stove, you don't touch it again.
Yeah.
So, Mike, what do you have up on your Substack?
Okay, well, it's MDS.
Good article, by the way, about the movie review. I liked it.
Well, I put it up as almost therapeutic.
Yes.
Because there's all this stuff going on. So I had a couple, the retrospective on the professionals. The one I put up a few days ago was on a favorite Twilight Zone episode, really dating myself because
Which is, I love the Twilight Zone.
That was broadcast in 1960, which I think was before your time even.
Yeah.
And it was called a Stop at Willoughby.
Oh yes,
Which is
he's on the train, and then it goes back in time
to 1880.
Oh, it's a great episode. Great.
So I did a write-up of it, and then I found a link to the full episode, which is now in there.
Great.
In the article, but it was, I'm doing more of this retrospective stuff, and there were good comments, not so much on the site, there were a few on the site, but people sent me direct email. Oh, this is great. I like reading about something other than current events.
Oh yeah.
And I have the one that I'm going to be putting up, which is it's called Media Hate Crimes, and it's probably going to go up this weekend. I'm still working on it, but it's I suggest that the bias of the media is nothing new.
Oh, sure.
And it goes back to at least 1924, and I talk about the celebrated case, among other things. I build up to it. Then I talk about the celebrated case of Leopold and Loeb.
Oh yeah, sure.
Remember that?
You brought that up. It was Clarence Darrow was their lawyer.
Yes.
And he would go on to the monkey trial. And by the way, if you ever study that, I put a little bit of that in my book about Darwin. You have to read the closing remarks delivered by, well, not personally, he passed away before he could deliver it. William Jennings Bryan, which are absolutely brilliant, fantastic. But Darrow developed this defense of Well, they didn't, this because of their culture that they murdered this boy. They couldn't help themselves. It was like something happened, took possession of them. So therefore they're innocent.
Well, he got the equivalent of over $1 million in legal fee. He was paid $70,000 in 1924 to do that. But the whole thing with that case was that it was whitewashed in the media. There was obviously a very heavy homosexual angle to it that was left out.
Right.
And
it was a thrill kill, right? They killed this boy because they wanted to see what it was like to murder someone, like because it was like exciting for them.
Because we're so smart.
Yeah, exactly. And these were two very privileged boys from like super, Upper East Side families.
It was actually a wealthy suburb of Chicago, but
okay.
But the point with that was that another
like your ringtone.
Another junk call. Yeah, sorry about that.
Okay.
That it was just the way this was portrayed.
Yes.
And then I talk about the Matthew Shepard case that people may remember. There was immediately a hate crime. And,
well, that turned out to be a little differently than the way it was portrayed. And I could talk about that because I interviewed the movie maker, the filmmaker. I did. This was years ago. I probably have it in my archive. I should look it up. But he went there to investigate that crime, expecting to do a story about Matthew Shepard being this great hero. And this movie maker was not, he was gay. I mean, he wasn't anti-gay. He was a liberal. Wasn't expecting to find out what he found out. But what he found out was that it was basically a drug deal that had gone wrong.
That's it.
And that one of the killers himself was gay. It wasn't like, maybe that might have entered into it, but that wasn't really what it was. And those two guys there was a death, all the liberals are coming, death penalty, they have to be executed. I mean, Matthew Shepard's mother actually had to step in to stop that. And, but the point is that it's like one of these things. It's like the George Floyd thing. I mean, any of these things, it's molded and shaped by what the media wants to talk about at that given time. And they find like a wedge, like a thing that they can use to create the right kind of emotion and the right kind of narrative to promote whatever it is they're trying to promote.
Maybe they're frustrated fiction writers or something. I mean, I suppose it would be very boring if you just wrote it like a straight police report. At 3:35 p.m., just blah, 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 blah. So they're going to bring in their own spin to it. But frankly, they don't have the talent to do it properly. And it ends up.
I think you're being kind here, Mike. I think this was. It's not just they did this because they wanted to present the story of how oppressed gay people are, especially in the West, in the backwoods, and that this guy was brutally murdered because he was gay, and that therefore this is a national crisis. We have to get up, everybody, they started doing posters and, all kinds of creative. There's a lot of money.
It's always a national crisis. I mean, one of the worst laws that was ever passed, and I don't think anyone can argue with this in terms of how it affected healthcare in the United States, was Medicare.
Right.
Medicare led to the federal regulation of all aspects of healthcare. It led to private insurance companies controlling how healthcare is doled out. It ruined the medical profession.
Yep.
And
it hurt people's health.
And the narrative at the time were these ridiculous stories of how old people are just dying in the streets, that they don't get care, and it was completely made up.
Oh yeah, I mean, they did the same. They rebranded that one and they pulled it out of mothballs for Obamacare. Remember they're showing Granny being pushed down the cliff, and I mean, it's classic agitprop.
Well, and, Medicare card number 1 was issued to who?
Franklin D. Roosevelt.
No. No, he was dead.
Oh no, it was Johnson.
Harry Truman.
Oh, okay. Yeah. All right. That's interesting.
And but the whole thing was that was the media narrative.
Yeah.
These
Well,
poor old people were just not getting the care, and never mind the fact that there were also, in fact, there was more than of charitable institutions giving care. There were clinics at every major hospital that were charity clinics. When I worked at the old Cedars of Lebanon Hospital in Hollywood, there was a whole area that was a charity clinic, part of Cedars of Lebanon. You don't see that anymore.
Oh, no. People were not turned away if they needed help. And, of course, I mean, ultimately, that big government program actually reduced care for people, and it basically decided who would get care and who wouldn't.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, look, the media manipulation, that goes way back. I mean, that goes back to Julius Caesar. I mean, right? I mean, if you study Roman history, certain Roman emperors were portrayed very poorly because they pissed off the Senate.
Yeah.
I mean, and others were portrayed heroically because they did the bidding of the Senate. I'm just saying that's just part of history. That a historian has to somehow look at how things are written and who did the writing and why. I mean, it's just the way it is. I mean, in this country, we were supposed to get away from that by having an independent media, the fifth estate, as they used to call it, that actually had diversity of opinion and competition. That's been over, I think, and I think the final nail was the Trump presidency. They had no integrity. I mean, the New York Times and all of them were doing stories based on like one anonymous source, which would never have happened. And then, of course, the next day they would retract it after they did the damage, after they destroyed people's reputation. Then in a small print, they'll retract it. And that became the standard. There was no, they didn't look into the 2020 election. We're not going to talk about that. But they never investigated the thousands of affidavits talking about things that were not quite right. All they did was demonize anybody who questioned it. And this was so coordinated and so concertized and at such a high level, and it's now becoming so digitized and electronic, that it just proves that the media now is not independent. It actually is like it was in Roman times, where the Roman Senate would basically hire somebody to write the history the way they wanted it written. I mean, all those Roman historians, Tacitus and Juvenal, and they all were hired. They were hacks. They were hired by wealthy Roman senators to write a history. Pliny, all of them. That's how history was done. I mean, it's difficult. The job of the historian is to try to see about what really happened. I mean, everyone has their biases, but was all very controlled. And now this country has moved in that direction.
Well, I always used to get a kick out of the fact that it was a big thing when in high school, when the smarter kids would say, no, I went to primary sources. And I said, well, how do you know those are accurate?
Exactly.
Just because you found a newspaper article from 1835, how do you know that is legit?
That's right. That's right. You have to go back, and the responsible historian tries to look at the whole picture and open the lens and see what was going on in the society at that time, who were the elites, who was powerful, and what did they believe? I mean, it's a very complex picture. And, the fact that this country, we to varying degrees, we've never had that fully, but at least we had some independence. I mean, after World War I, there were several great historians who wrote books criticizing America's entry into that war, and the establishment figured out how to demonize them. People like Harry Elmer Barnes, the author of the book Perpetual War for Perpetual Peace. He laid out exactly what American foreign policy has been from World War I up until now. And he was denounced and demonized. They said he was pro-Nazi or something. The point is that's when things started to go south in terms of an independent publishers. There's only one real good conservative publishing house now. That's Regnery. Other than that, it's all very controlled. The gatekeepers are all controlling the means of communication. And it's become almost hermetically sealed. Although I'm hopeful, because we're doing this, and because we now do have competing media like Rumble and Gab and Getter and all these others that are coming.
It comes down to economics. When an opportunity was created for some alternative, and Rumble and others could make money off it, then there
Yeah.
you go.
Well, we still have freedom. We still have a free market in this country. We still have freedom. That's why they're getting rid of their damn mandates. But we have to keep at it. We have to keep exposing it when we can and using whatever vehicles we have to do that. Anyway, Mike, but so what is the name of your Substack?
Okay, it's called Mike's Point of View, but it's MDS for my
Okay.
initials, POV.substack.com.
Okay.
And we got some articles up on there, and we're putting a lot of content. We are trying to mix, sort of cool entertainment review stuff with. I mean, I can't write this depressing event stuff all the time.
No, it's very well thought out. I recommend people go there. I just read your an article about your one of your movie reviews. This is, I mean, it has great social content, but it's also cultural and it's interesting.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I'm glad you're doing what you're doing.
Well, thank you. And I'm glad you're doing what you do.
All right. So I'll talk to you next week at the usual time.
The usual time. Have a good weekend.